That night there were no screams, no chaos, no blood. There was only a silence, so dense it felt as though it pressed against the chest. Darkness had fully settled in, not the darkness of a deep forest, but the darkness of a town, with its lights extinguished, its doors tightly shut, its people finished with their choices, and no longer needing to say anything more. The man standing there knew he was about to die, but what made it hard to breathe was not the thought of death itself. It was the way he was being looked at, not with hatred, not with pity, but with a hollow, distant stare, as if those watching him no longer saw a human being at all. They looked at him the way one looks at something that must be removed, like a rotten branch, or an animal too badly injured to be saved. This silence was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of agreement. Everyone in the crowd knew why they were there, and more importantly, they believed their presence was justified. No one needed to shout. No one needed to give orders. Everything had been decided long before that night arrived. To an outside observer, it might have seemed like just another execution in an age accustomed to death. But there was something different about this moment. The man had not been condemned by a court alone, but by the entire community. Before any sentence was spoken, before any punishment was carried out, he had already been judged in the minds of those around him. And in those minds, he was no longer a human being like them. No transformation took place that night. No fur emerged from the skin. No claws tore through the air. No howl rose from the darkness. None of the things that would later be attached to the name werewolf were present. The only thing that changed was the way people looked at him, and that change was irreversible. A human being can die twice. The first time is when the heart stops beating. The second time is when society stops seeing him as human. For this man, the second death had occurred long before he stood there that night. Perhaps from the first moment, someone whispered a name. Perhaps from the moment rumors began to replace facts. Or perhaps from the moment the fear of an entire community needed a shape, and he was the most convenient one. In the weak light of torches and fire, the man saw familiar faces, people who had once greeted him, people who had once passed him without notice, people who had shared the same space, breathed the same air. Now the distance between them was no longer physical, but moral. On the other side of that distance, they saw something else, something they believed was not like them, and therefore could be destroyed without burdening their conscience. This was the most dangerous moment in human history. Not when a beast attacks a village, but when a community collectively agrees that one of its own has become something no longer deserving of human rules. When that happens, violence no longer needs to be hidden. It becomes a duty. It becomes justice. It becomes the right thing to do. Later, people would call the man Gilles Garnier. They would attach to him a terrifying title, a name strong enough to silence children and unsettle adults. But on that final night, before the name became legend, before it was printed and spread, Gilles Garnier was simply a human being who had been stripped of the right to be seen as human. What is frightening is not whether he truly committed the acts he was accused of. What is frightening is that the society around him no longer felt the need to answer that question. They had found what they needed: an explanation for fear, a vessel for anxiety, an excuse to believe that terrible things were happening, not because the world was chaotic, but because of a specific monster. That night, as Gilles Garnier stood in silence, what was being judged was not merely the actions of one individual. It was the fragile boundary between human and monster, and that boundary was not drawn by nature, but by the collective, by people who believed they were protecting order, while in truth they were creating a myth that would outlive them all. If no one saw a wolf, if no one witnessed a transformation, then how did the werewolf appear? The answer does not lie in the forest. It lies in the moment a community decides to stop seeing one of its own as human. To understand how that moment became possible, one must go back before that night. Back before the name Gilles Garnier was whispered. back to a time when fear had no shape yet, but was already strong enough to search for a face. Before the name Gilles Garnier was ever whispered in private conversations, before any accusation took shape, Dole was already a community pushed to its limits, not by the pressure of open war, but by a slow, persistent strain that wore it down day after day. Life there did not collapse in a single moment. It slipped gradually, slowly enough for people to grow accustomed to unease, yet quickly enough that they never fully understood what was happening. Hunger was the constant background noise of that era. It did not always appear as absolute desperation, but it was always present, a reminder of how fragile order truly was. Meals became simpler. Supplies dwindled. People began counting loaves of bread, counting harvests, counting the days they could still endure. When hunger enters everyday life, it does more than affect the body. It changes how people think, how they see one another, and how they make sense of the world around them. In such a community, children carried a particular meaning. They were not only sons and daughters, but signs that a future still existed. When children began to disappear, the impact reached far beyond the private grief of individual families. It struck directly at the sense of safety of the entire town. No one knew exactly what had happened, only that one child did not return, then another. That absence had no shape, no explanation, and for that very reason, it became more frightening than any concrete evidence ever could. At first, people searched for familiar reasons: accidents, getting lost, wild animals, but each explanation quickly revealed its weakness. There were no clear traces, no reliable witnesses, nothing solid enough to close the fear. When ordinary answers no longer worked, the human mind began to reach for other possibilities, ones that under normal circumstances might have been dismissed. The forest surrounding Dole was no longer just part of the landscape. It became a symbol. By day, it was familiar and necessary. By night, it turned into a dense black mass, where every sound carried a different meaning, where imagination could move freely. In the context of missing children, the forest did not need to do anything to become frightening. Its mere existence was enough. It represented everything that could not be controlled, everything that could not be fully seen. Yet even the forest was too vague to carry the full weight of the community's fear. An anonymous space cannot be punished. A darkness cannot be put on trial. Fear to become bearable requires a concrete form. It needs a cause that can be named, an object that can be held responsible. Until that happened, fear continued to spread, seeping into conversations and cautious glances. What is important to understand is that at this point, there was no concept of a werewolf guiding the community's thinking. There were no stories of transformation, no complete myth. What existed was only a sense that something was deeply wrong, that the danger did not come from a distant place, but from within the very space they inhabited. When people do not know exactly what they should fear, they tend to fear everything, especially what appears different. Prolonged instability eroded trust between people. Behaviors once considered harmless began to draw scrutiny. The difference became suspicious. Someone who lived more isolated than others, someone quiet, someone who did not fully fit the shared pattern. In that atmosphere, difference did not need to be extreme to signal danger. It only needed to exist. The familiar institutions of society were still present, but they no longer offered the reassurance they once had. Law existed, but it could not or prevent the disappearances. The church stood, but prayers did not bring the children back. When these pillars failed to satisfy the deepest need for protection, people began searching for other explanations, even ones that had never been tested. A community under sustained pressure does not remain still. It either fractures or attempts to restore order differently. In Dole's case, a new order had not yet emerged, but the need for one had become urgent. People needed to believe that what was happening could be understood, could be explained, and eventually could be stopped. In that context, the idea of a monster still unnamed began to take shape as an appealing possibility. A monster offers a simple explanation for a complex world. It allows people to believe that suffering has a cause that chaos is not random. More importantly, it allows a community to believe that if the threat can be identified and removed, everything will return to normal. It is an unspoken promise, and in desperate times, such promises carry immense power. At this moment, Dole did not yet have a monster, but it had all the conditions necessary to create one. Fear without a shape hovered in the air, searching for something to cling to. And when that fear finally found a name, a process no one in the town would be able to reverse would begin. After a long period of living under a state of vague tension, Dole's fear began to change shape. It was no longer just something hanging in the air, no longer only unanswered questions about the children who had vanished. That fear began searching for something concrete, a place to rest, a face to attach itself to. And like many dangerous moments in history, the shift did not occur through a grand declaration, but through a very small statement. No one can say exactly when the first name was spoken. It may have happened in a side conversation when two people stood close enough to whisper yet far enough to deny responsibility. It may have occurred in a moment of hesitation when someone finally said aloud what they had been thinking for some time, but had never dared to share. However it happened, that moment did not carry the weight of an accusation. It felt more like a question, a suggestion, a feeling that had not yet found its words. The name came without evidence. There were no new witnesses, no discovery that altered the situation. The only thing that accompanied it was a hard-to-define sense that something was amiss about this person, not like the others, not fully belonging to the familiar order of the community. In a peaceful time, such a feeling might have been ignored. In Dole, that year, it was enough to create a fracture. The initial change was subtle. No one stood up and pointed. No one said anything outright, but the looks began to change. Someone who had once been greeted now received only brief nods. Someone who had once blended into the crowd now found themselves standing at its edge. There was no official explanation, but the shift was real, and the person affected felt it long before they understood its cause. The first stage was suspicion. It was not loud, not public. It lived in quiet assumptions, in the way ordinary actions were reinterpreted. Silence became a sign of concealment. A withdrawn way of life became evidence of something abnormal. Small details, meaningless on their own, began to be strung together into an unspoken narrative. When suspicion grew strong enough, it led to isolation. The person was no longer invited into shared activities. Conversations ended when they drew near. Distance was created, not through violence, but through avoidance. This allowed the community to preserve its moral image. No one was harming anyone. They were simply no longer treating this person the same. Yet that very change marked the beginning of a process that stripped a human being of their humanity. Isolation created a dangerous loop. The more separated the person became, the more different they appeared. The more different they appeared, the easier they were to suspect. No new wrongdoing was required. The mere existence of distance was enough to reinforce the sense that something was not right. In such a context, returning to one's former place became nearly impossible. After suspicion and isolation came observation. Not formal surveillance with guards or records, but collective watching, where every action was viewed through a lens already in place. People no longer looked to understand, but to confirm. Every gesture, every appearance or absence could be interpreted in a way that strengthened the growing fear. What stands out is that throughout this entire process, no new evidence appeared. No event changed the objective reality. The only thing that changed was the story the community told itself. And once that story began to be shared widely enough, it became a form of social truth, even without any concrete proof behind it. The feeling that something was not right played a central role at this moment. It was vague, difficult to grasp, yet deeply persuasive. It allowed people to believe they were responding to a real threat, even if they could not define what that threat was. More importantly, once the feeling was shared, it created cohesion. Those who suspected together felt that they understood one another. And in a community under pressure, the sense of shared agreement carried enormous weight. At this stage, the person under suspicion was not yet called a monster, but they were no longer considered harmless either. They existed in a dangerous gray zone where every action could be interpreted negatively. The boundary between human being and threat began to blur, not because of any change in the individual, but because of a change in how the community saw them. This was the moment of ignition, even though it appeared quiet on the surface. Once a name had been attached to collective fear, what followed no longer depended on truth. It depended on how the story was told, repeated, and believed. From this point on, what would happen was no longer merely a reaction to fear, but an effort by the entire community to turn that fear into a story with order. Once suspicion had been planted, truth no longer stood alone. It had to compete with narratives created to explain what could not be explained. And in that competition, truth rarely prevailed. This would become even clearer as stories began to replace reality, and as the idea of danger took on a more defined shape in the minds of those who believed they had already begun to understand it. Once suspicion had taken root, truth began to shift its position within the life of the community. It did not disappear at once. At first, it was simply pushed aside, making room for accounts that felt more reasonable, easier to remember, and most importantly, easier to share. In Dole, this shift happened quietly without warning, but once it began, it was difficult to reverse. Rumors did not arrive as a sudden wave, but as small ripples spreading across the surface of the water. Each person received a fragment of information, added a personal assumption, and passed it along with slight unconscious adjustments. No one believed they were fabricating anything. They were trying to make sense of what was happening in the way that felt most meaningful to them. And in a community under pressure, understanding things in the same way brought a sense of safety. Witnesses began to appear in a very particular manner. No one stepped forward claiming to have seen something clearly. Instead, there were hesitant statements. Someone said they thought they had seen a figure in the forest. Another said they had heard strange sounds at night. These accounts were too vague to verify, yet too ambiguous to dismiss entirely. It was precisely this ambiguity that made them dangerous. Each account carried a gap, and that gap was quickly filled by the imagination of the listener. As the story was retold, the space was filled with details familiar to the fear already present. A shadow became a suspicious shape. A strange sound became a sign of threat. The story did not need to be accurate. It only needed to align with the shared feeling that something was endangering the community. What stands out is how the stories began to resemble one another with remarkable consistency, not because people had witnessed the same event, but because they shared the same fear. Once a narrative pattern formed, new accounts tended to adjust themselves to fit it. Details that did not align were dropped. Familiar elements were emphasized. Over time, the diversity of individual experiences was compressed into a single unified collective story. At this stage, truth was no longer the decisive factor. Consistency mattered more. A story repeated often enough, with minimal variation, began to feel true. Not because it had been proven, but because it offered a sense of order in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. People did not need a correct explanation. They needed one that allowed them to sleep at night. Language played a central role in this process. Each word was chosen not only to describe, but to guide how others should feel. Vague yet evocative phrases were favored. Details that made the story vivid were retained. Gradually, the story was not just told, but rehearsed. People learned where to emphasize, where to remain silent, and how to speak, so the listener would understand exactly what was meant. As this happened, the person under suspicion slowly disappeared from the story as an individual. They were no longer described through ordinary human traits. Instead, they appeared as a role within the narrative taking shape. Details of their real life were set aside because they no longer served the flow of the story. What mattered was that the story moved smoothly, that it made sense within the logic of fear. Once the story reached a certain level of consistency, it began to protect itself. Any information that contradicted it was treated with suspicion. Those who asked questions were met with confusion, even wariness. Not because they were wrong, but because they threatened a mental structure the community had come to rely on to function. In that context, truth became disruptive, while the story became stabilizing. This did not happen because people suddenly lost their capacity for reason. It happened because reason had to compete with fear. And in certain moments, fear is a more powerful organizing force than any argument. It rearranges priorities, shifts standards of judgment, and defines what is considered important. At that point, whether a story is true or not is no longer the central question. The question is whether it helps the community feel safer. At this moment, the werewolf had not yet emerged as a fully formed figure, but all of its components were already present: a vague threat, a suspected individual, repeated stories with a shared structure. Language was gradually creating an entity that did not yet need to exist in the physical world. What was being born was not a creature, but an idea, a role that someone would soon be forced to occupy. Once the story began to replace truth, the next stage was almost inevitable. The story required confirmation. It needed a moment to shift from narration to declaration. And when that moment arrived, the community would no longer simply speak about danger. They would begin to believe that the danger had been found. Once the stories had become similar enough, the community lost patience with ambiguity. A fear that lingers too long without confirmation begins to demand an ending. It needs a moment when everything is said clearly, when what was once whispered becomes a declaration. In Dole, that moment arrived in the form of a confession. No one knows exactly how it began. There is no record of the first moment a question was asked or the first moment silence was broken. All that is known is that after days of suspicion, isolation, and being watched with eyes searching for confirmation, the man spoke. And when he did, the entire community seemed to hold its breath. The confession did not come as resistance. It was not a cry of innocence. It resembled acceptance. Not acceptance of guilt in the modern sense, but acceptance of the role society was waiting for him to fill. What was told was not a series of ordinary details, but a story shaped like something everyone had already prepared themselves to believe. He spoke of a creature in the forest, not clearly described, not given a precise form, only vague enough to awaken fears that already existed. A being that appeared at night, a presence that did not belong to the familiar world. When those words were spoken, many in the crowd felt a strange sense of recognition, as if they had been waiting for them all along. Then came the detail of what was called transforming substance. No one asked what it looked like. No one asked how it worked. The idea of something capable of changing a human being was enough to complete the picture. It provided a mechanism, an explanation for how an ordinary person could become a threat. No science was required, no logic, only a story strong enough to connect scattered points into a single narrative. What mattered was that the confession introduced nothing new. It did not reveal a truth no one had heard before. Instead, it repeated exactly what the community had already imagined in silence. The creature in the forest explained the darkness. The transforming substance explained the abnormality. Every detail fit perfectly, as if the story had been prepared in advance, waiting only for the right person to speak it aloud. There was no need to determine whether the confession was true or false. At that moment, the question no longer mattered. What mattered was that it worked. It turned a series of vague anxieties into a complete story with a cause, a mechanism, and someone to hold responsible. In that instant, fear was reorganized. It became easier to understand, and therefore easier to accept. A sense of relief spread through the crowd. No one said it aloud, but it was unmistakably present. What had once kept them awake at night now had a name. What had once been inexplicable now had an explanation. The cost of that relief was the acceptance that one of their own was no longer human. And at that moment, that cost felt reasonable. The confession did not need to be detailed. It did not need to be consistent by the standards of truth. It only needed to be consistent with fear. And it achieved that perfectly. Every detail reinforced what was already believed. There were no contradictions large enough to disrupt the flow of the story, no gaps that forced the listener to doubt. Everything moved smoothly in the direction the community desired. In that moment, the werewolf was born, not in the forest, not under the moonlight, but in language, in the silent agreement that this story was sufficient. From that point on, the man was no longer merely an object of suspicion. He became the embodiment of the threat, a role already written, now finally filled. What is most frightening is not the content of the confession, but the way it closed off every other question. When a story explains too many things at once, it tends to eliminate the need to ask anything further. Why do the children disappear? Why the community felt unsafe? Why does the forest become terrifying? All of it now shared a single answer. And when there is only one answer, all other questions become unnecessary. From that moment forward, truth no longer had a chance to compete. It was not rejected. It was simply no longer needed. The confession had fulfilled its function. It transformed fear into something that could be faced. It turned chaos into narrative order. And it cleared the path for the next step, when the story would not only be believed, but formally affirmed. Once the community had heard what it had been waiting for, it no longer occupied the position of listener. It became the confirmer. And from that moment on, what followed was no longer the result of fear itself, but the result of a story that had been accepted as sufficiently true. After the confession was spoken, the story did not stop. It entered another phase, quieter but no less disturbing. At this stage, what mattered was no longer what had been said, but how the story was preserved, reinforced, and repeated until it was no longer questioned. This was the moment when a human being was not only called a monster, but began to learn how to exist within that role. What followed the confession was not a series of dramatic acts. It did not require public torture or loud displays of violence. The most effective pressure is often steady, repetitive, and difficult to recognize. The questions that were asked were not meant to uncover new information. They were meant to ensure that the story already told would remain unchanged. Interrogation in this context was not a process of discovering truth. It was a process of shaping narrative. Questions were asked in guiding, suggestive ways. When a detail was accepted, it was repeated. When a detail caused hesitation, it was adjusted. No physical force was required. Only patience, repetition, and enough authority to make the person being questioned understand that some answers were more desirable than others. Pressure did not come from a single source. It came from the constant presence of those who represented the community, from expectant gazes, from prolonged silence following an unsuitable answer, from the sense that every deviation meant starting over again. In such conditions, people learn quickly what helps them escape uncertainty, even if only temporarily. Repetition was the crucial element. When a story is told enough times, it begins to feel familiar. Familiarity is easily mistaken for truth. Details that were first spoken in vague terms gradually became sharper, not because they were more accurate, but because they had been repeated more often. Each repetition made the story feel more solid, both to the teller and to those listening. During this process, the man was not merely recounting a story. He was learning how to tell it. He began to recognize which rhythm caused listeners to nod, which details eased the tension in the room, which elements made the story feel complete. Gradually, the narrative ceased to be a response to questions and became a script being performed. This does not mean he was deliberately lying in any simple sense. In such circumstances, the boundary between memory, imagination, and the expectations of others becomes blurred. When a story is required to be repeated with the same structure, human memory tends to adjust itself accordingly. What once felt like speculation begins to be recalled as experience. What was once suggested begins to feel like personal truth. The greatest pressure lay not in what was said, but in what was not allowed to change. Once the story had been accepted at the level of the community, any deviation became dangerous. Consistency came to matter more than accuracy. The storyteller learned that safety did not come from being correct, but from being consistent. In this way, the story reinforced itself. At this stage, the man was no longer only assigned the role of a monster from the outside. He began to internalize that role, not because he believed it to be true, but because it was the only way to exist within a system that had already decided its outcome. When every question led to the same conclusion, resisting that conclusion became pointless. Learning the story became a form of adaptation. What is most unsettling is that this process required no overt cruelty. It operated through normalcy, through habit, through the internal logic of a system convinced it was doing what was necessary. In this context, a human being could be turned into a monster without any physical transformation. The transformation occurred in language and memory, and in the way a person was allowed to speak about themselves. Once the story had been learned, it was no longer a response to the community's fear. It became proof of that fear. Each repetition strengthened the belief that the monster was real, that the threat had been identified. The loop closed. The community heard what it needed to hear. The storyteller said what he was expected to say. No one needed to ask further questions. From this point on, the story no longer belonged to an individual. It became shared property of the community. It could be retold, interpreted, and used without the presence of the one who first spoke it. The man, in learning how to tell the story that turned him into a monster, was simultaneously pushed out of its center. He was no longer a subject. He was evidence. And once a human being has become evidence for a story, the next step is no longer whether the story is true. The next step is how the system will use it to close off fear. What follows will not be an attempt to understand more, but an effort to confirm what has already been accepted as sufficiently clear. Once the story had been learned and repeated enough times, society required one final step to turn belief into order. That was when the law entered, not to ask questions, but to close the remaining ones. The public trial appeared as a necessary ritual, a space where the community could see itself doing what it believed to be right. The trial did not begin with curiosity. It began with certainty. Those who attended did not come to hear what had truly happened. They came to witness the confirmation of what they already believed. In that room, silence carried a different meaning. It was no longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of agreement formed long before. Law, in this context, did not operate as a tool for discovering truth. It functioned as an official language for expressing what the community had already decided. Procedures were carried out in full. Questions were asked according to form, but the direction of the trial was already set. Each step served only to guide everyone toward an ending that had been anticipated. No one in the room asked why the children had disappeared in that way. No one pursued alternative possibilities. What had been told and retold was now presented within a legal framework. Once a story is placed into the language of law, it acquires the appearance of certainty. It looks orderly, it looks reasonable, and therefore it looks true. The true purpose of the trial was not to determine guilt or innocence. Its purpose was to reassure the community. After months of living in uncertainty, people needed a moment of closure. They needed to believe that what they had done was necessary, that their fear had a clear cause, and that this cause was being addressed. The trial provided exactly that. In this role, law became a social ritual. It gathered people together. It placed them in the position of witnesses to justice. And most importantly, it allowed them to leave with the feeling that order had been restored, or at least was on its way to being restored. Truth, if it still existed, somewhere no longer occupied the center. The questions asked during the trial were meant to confirm rather than to explore. When a detail was repeated, that it was not to test its accuracy, but to bind it more tightly to the shared narrative. Minor contradictions, if they existed, were not pursued. They did not serve the greater purpose of closing fear. In this context, doubt became a disruptive element. The person on trial stood in the center of the room more as a symbol than as an individual. He no longer represented himself. He represented everything the community had feared, imagined, and told itself. When the story was repeated before the court, it no longer required the living presence of that human being. The role was clear enough. The content was complete. What is striking is that no one in this trial felt they were doing something wrong. Those involved did not believe they were participating in a tragedy. On the contrary, they believed they were fulfilling a duty. When justice is performed as a ritual, it allows people to feel moral without confronting the deeper consequences of their actions. The trial ended not with discovery, but with confirmation. The story had been heard repeated and now stamped with authority. From that moment on, it was no longer the account of an individual or the belief of a small group. It became an acknowledged truth, not because it was correct, but because it had passed through enough formal stages to be treated as correct. This closure brought a sense of relief. No longer were they hanging in the air. No more sleepless nights caused by what could not be named. The threat had been identified. The threat had been brought into the open, and the threat, according to shared belief, was about to be removed. The community could exhale, at least for a moment. But in that moment, something essential had taken place. When law legitimizes belief, it turns fear into order. It turns the story into a foundation for action. And once that process is complete, what follows no longer requires persuasion. It becomes the natural outcome of a process society has already accepted. The trial was never meant to uncover the truth, and it did not need to. Its function was fulfilled the moment the community believed justice was being carried out. From this point on, the story no longer needed to be told to convince. It was strong enough to direct action. And when justice has become ritual, the next step is no longer debate, but the completion of that ritual in the way everyone has been waiting for. When the trial ended, there was no emotional eruption, no cheers, no chaos. The tale moved into the next moment with a calm that was deeply unsettling. Everything unfolded as if it had been arranged in advance, not by an invisible hand, but by the quiet agreement of everyone present. What was about to happen was not seen as a tragedy. It was seen as the final step of a necessary process. The crowd gathered not out of simple curiosity. They came because they believed this was something that needed to be witnessed. Their presence carried collective meaning. Each person standing there was part of the story, even if no one said it aloud. When a community witnesses an act, together that act no longer belongs to the individual who performs it. It becomes shared property. The atmosphere was not heavy in the way one might expect. It was not tense. It was stable. People stood beside one another exchanging glances. Some brought their children with them, not to teach them about violence, but to show them that order was being protected. Children were lifted, not so they could see more clearly, but so they could become part of the moment, even if they could not yet understand its meaning. No one described in detail what took place at the center, and that was unnecessary. The focus was not on the act itself, but on the response, on the way the crowd remained still, on the way they looked, on the silence that was not broken. This silence was different from the one before. It was no longer waiting. It was confirmation that everything was unfolding as expected. In that moment, the man standing at the center was no longer a human being with his own story. He was the conclusion of a collective line of reasoning. The answer to sleepless nights. Proof that fear had been addressed. When the community looked at him, they did not see an individual. They saw the end of unease. What is striking is that no one felt that they were doing something wrong. Those present experienced no moral conflict. They believed what was happening was necessary, even right. That belief did not need to be spoken. It was present in the way people stood still, in the way they did not turn away, in the way they accepted the moment as a natural part of communal life. Children held in the arms of adults, did not fully understand what was happening, but they sensed the attitude of those around them. They learned through observation, not explanation. They saw that the crowd was not panicked. They saw that no one objected. And from this, they absorbed a silent lesson that there are moments when removing a human being is considered necessary to protect order. This is the most haunting moment, not because of what was done, but because of how it was accepted. A community learned that there are circumstances in which killing a person is not regarded as a crime, but as a duty. When this lesson is learned collectively, it does not need to be repeated in words. It is remembered through experience. After everything was over, the crowd dispersed not in disorder, but in calm. People returned home. Life continued. Meals still needed to be prepared. Doors still needed to be closed when night fell. But something had changed. Not everyone noticed it immediately, but it existed within the shared memory of the community. This moment did not fade with time. It did not need to be retold in detail. It was recalled through silence when someone asked, through exchanged glances when the story was hinted at, through the shared decision not to look too closely. That was enough to keep it alive in collective memory. What matters is not what happened to that man, but what happened to the community. They crossed a boundary together. And once a boundary is crossed, an agreement returning becomes difficult. They learned that the stories they believe can lead to action, and that action, when framed correctly, can be seen as justified. This moment became a reference point for what would follow, not only in Dole, but elsewhere in other stories. It showed that to create a monster, one does not need magic or transformation. Only a story strong enough, a fear large enough, and a community willing to look in the same direction. After that day, no one needed to explain again why what had happened was right. The story had completed its cycle. It began with fear, was shaped by narrative confirmed by law, and concluded by a ritual everyone remembered. And because it was remembered in that way, it did not end with that moment. What remained was not the image of a human being removed, but the memory of a community that had collectively believed it was necessary. That memory would not disappear. It would spread, be retold, adjusted, and used as a pattern. And from there, the story would no longer belong to one place or one time. It would become a silent lesson in how human beings can learn that killing under certain conditions is right. After the day of the execution, the story could have ended. A community had identified a threat, dealt with it, and closed the chapter of fear. By ordinary logic, everything should have returned to normal. But the opposite happened. Instead of fading away, the story began to move. It left Dole not through official records or orders from above. It spread through the most familiar pathway of fear storytelling. Those who had witnessed it told relatives in neighboring regions. Those listeners told others with the certainty of people who believed they were passing along an important lesson. With each retelling, the story did not lose strength. It became more compact, easier to understand, and easier to apply. In other villages, the circumstances were not identical to Dole, but the feeling was unmistakably familiar. There was hunger. There was instability. There were disappearances without explanation. When the story from Dole arrived, it was not received as a distant tragedy, but as a warning, an example, a template for what could happen when fear went unchecked. New cases began to appear, and what mattered was not that they were identical. They only needed to share enough similarities: a person living apart, a rumor that lingered, a chain of events without a clear explanation. The existing story provided a way to read these signs. It told communities that they had seen this before and that they knew where it led. At this stage, the werewolf was no longer bound to a specific individual. It became a role that could be filled. Once certain conditions appeared, the role activated on its own. No new imagination was required, no new invention. The formula already existed. That formula was terrifyingly simple: a collective fear, an unusual individual, repeated stories, a fitting confession, a confirming trial, and finally a closing ritual. Each step did not need to be perfect. It only needed to feel familiar. That familiarity produced a sense of control, and it was this sense of control that allowed the formula to be repeated. This explains why later cases often shared eerily similar details, not because people were truly experiencing the same events, but because they were telling the same story. Once a template is accepted, it shapes how people interpret their experiences. Details that do not fit are ignored. Details that do fit are emphasized. Reality is bent to match the narrative. Over time, the werewolf no longer required a specific forest or a particular darkness. It could appear anywhere pressure was high enough. It did not need a consistent form, only its essential elements: a hidden threat, a suspected human being, a community ready to believe they were facing something no longer fully human. Once the story became a motif, it began to function as a tool, not a tool of truth, but of order. It allowed communities to identify threats, quickly categorize people quickly, and act quickly. In a world of instability, this speed and clarity were treated as advantages. The cost of that clarity was rarely mentioned. What matters is that none of these communities believed they were copying a tragedy. Each believed its situation was unique, its decision necessary. But from the outside, the pattern was clear. Different stories began to look alike. Different outcomes followed the same logic. The werewolf, once a name attached to a single person, had become a reusable concept. Once that happened, the story no longer required a clear point of origin. It existed as a standing possibility. When the right conditions appeared, it activated automatically. No orders were needed. No design was required. It operated as a collective reflex, learned through stories told and retold. This is why the story did not end in Dole. It could not end there. It had crossed the boundary of a single case and become a way of understanding the world. Once fear is successfully framed as a formula, it tends to be applied whenever fear returns. And because fear is inseparable from human life, the formula always finds ground to exist. From that point on, the werewolf was no longer a single individual burned into the memory of one town. It became a mobile pattern, ready to appear, wherever there was enough pressure, enough unease, and enough people who believed they already knew how the story would end. Once the story had become a motif, the next step was almost inevitable. It moved out of human memory and into material form, from spoken word to written text, from memory to image. And once that happened, fear no longer depended on the storyteller. It became fixed. Pamphlets emerged as a natural product of the era. They were not history books, nor were they legal documents. They were brief, easy to read, and designed to circulate quickly. Their purpose was not analysis, but impact, a condensed story, a warning, an example of what could happen if a community failed to remain vigilant. What mattered was not the accuracy of what was printed. What mattered was that the story could now be held in one's hands. Once fear was set into print, it took on the appearance of certainty. It was no longer a rumor that could be dismissed. It was something that was recorded, distributed, and considered important enough to publish. And in the human mind, what is printed carries a particular weight. Alongside text, images began to play a decisive role. Engravings appeared depicting a figure that grew increasingly familiar, a body half human, half beast, a threatening posture, a face not entirely human. No one concerned themselves with whether these images were based on observation. What mattered was consistency. They allowed the viewer to recognize what they were looking at immediately. Before this, fear existed in many vague forms. Each person imagined it differently. But once images were standardized, imagination was guided in a single direction. The werewolf now had a face, a stance, repeating features, and when an image is repeated often enough, it begins to look like something that has always existed. Pamphlets and engravings did more than retell the story. They taught people how to look. They indicated what should be feared and how that fear should be framed. When a child saw the image for the first time, the full story was unnecessary. The image had already done the hardest work. It planted a template in memory that any later story could activate. Fear, once printed, became mobile. It no longer depended on someone having been present when events occurred. It could travel farther faster and last longer. A town that had never witnessed such a case could still feel familiar with the story, not because it had lived through it, but because it had seen the images, read the accounts, absorbed the fear as part of the world. This standardization produced a false sense of stability. When everyone feared the same thing, fear became easier to manage. It had a name, a form, a story is attached to it. This allowed communities to believe they understood the threat, even if they had never encountered it. That understanding came not from experience, but from repetition. From that moment on, the werewolf no longer needed to be created anew. It already existed within a shared archive of images and stories. When a new community came under pressure, it did not need to imagine. It only needed to recognize. Recognize familiar signs. Recognize images seen on paper. Recognize stories told before. And from that recognition, fear immediately took shape. The danger of print did not lie in spreading false information. It lay in stripping away context. A story detached from its specific time and place becomes a universal example. It is read as a rule, not as a case. And once a case is read as a rule, it can be applied anywhere. Standardized images of the werewolf did not merely recount the past, they shaped the future. They taught people that danger could be identified, that it looked like this, that it behaved like that, and more importantly, that it could be dealt with in a way already proven effective. The story did not just explain fear, it instructed action. Once fear was printed, it became harder to challenge. A rumor can be denied. An image on paper is far more difficult to dispute. It looks like evidence even when it is not. It exists independently of the storyteller. And because of that, it appears objective. In the human mind, what appears objective is more readily believed. From that point forward, the werewolf was no longer the product of a single community. It became part of a broader collective imagination. It could be named anywhere, and each time it was named, it carried with it the full history that had been printed, standardized, and repeated. Fear no longer needed to be created. It only needed to be activated. Once text and image had completed their work, the story entered a new phase. It no longer required the presence of immediate fear. It could exist even when the threat was no longer clear. And it was in this phase, when fear had become part of printed culture, that voices of doubt began to emerge. But by then, the story was already strong enough to resist being easily shaken. After the story had been printed, after images had acquired faces, and fear had taken on a stable form, other voices began to appear. They did not come from the crowd. They came from the margins, and they came too late. Some physicians began to ask questions, not about myth, but about the human body and mind. They examined confessions, descriptions of behavior, and recognized familiar patterns in a different way. They spoke of disorders, of delusions of mental states, distorted by hunger and prolonged pressure. They did not deny that violence had occurred. They questioned the way that violence was being explained. Legal scholars also began to reopen records. They noticed blurred edges, testimonies that were repeated with unsettling similarity, trials that moved too quickly toward a conclusion. They questioned procedure standards of evidence and the true role of confession under conditions of extreme pressure. For them, the concern was not only the outcome of a single case, but the precedent it established. Some skeptics belonged to no professional group. They offered no complex theories. They were simply unconvinced. They noticed that each new story resembled the last in suspicious ways. They asked why every account led to the same shape, the same ending. For them, excessive repetition was not proof, but a sign of an imposed pattern. These voices were not loud. They did not fully agree with one another, and most importantly, they did not appear at the same time. Each person voiced doubt in a private space with limited reach. There was no movement, no collective gathering, only scattered questions, cast into a space already crowded with answers. The problem was not a lack of reasoning. The problem was timing. Society at this stage no longer needs doubt. It had invested too much in the existing story. It had used it to calm fear, to organize action, to instruct the next generation. Returning to questions threatened not just a belief, but the entire mental order that had been built. Physicians spoke about the mind. Society heard instability. Legal scholars spoke about procedure. Society heard the delay. Skeptics spoke about the possibility of error. Society heard danger, not because the arguments were weak, but because they came from outside the accepted narrative. When a story has become the foundation of safety, anything that unsettles it is treated as a threat. Those who question are no longer seen as seekers of truth. They are seen as disruptors, as people who do not understand the seriousness of the situation, as people willing to place theory above the safety of the community. Notably, society did not need to silence these voices openly. Most of the time, it only needed to ignore them. No answers, no responses, no space within official discourse. Silence once again proved to be the most effective tool. When no one listens, doubt cannot spread. There was another reason these voices failed to take root. They offered no relief. They provided no alternative story strong enough to replace the existing one. They only opened more questions. And, in a society exhausted by uncertainty, additional doubt was not appealing. People tend to choose certainty, even when that certainty rests on fragile foundations. Over time, these doubtful voices sank beneath the surface, not because they were completely refuted, but because they were no longer mentioned. They survived in records, in private exchanges, in marginal notes, but they no longer influenced how the story was told to the wider public. The dominant narrative prevailed not through argument, but through repetition and convenience. This created a troubling paradox. Those capable of seeing differently, of understanding differently, were pushed aside precisely when they might have prevented the story from becoming absolute. But once society had gone far enough, stopping became more difficult than continuing. Admitting error required not only individual courage, but collective restructuring that few communities were willing to attempt. And so doubt arrived, but too late. It was not strong enough to break the story. It was only strong enough to exist as an undercurrent, persistent, never entirely disappearing. And it is this quiet persistence that creates a subtler sensation, a sense that somewhere beneath the surface of the official narrative, something remains unresolved. That sensation does not change what has already happened. It does not bring back those who were lost, but it leaves a fracture in the surface of certainty, a small crack difficult to see, yet enough to reveal that truth and belief do not always align. And that crack will matter far more as the story continues to be told, not only as myth, but as a mirror reflecting how societies confront their own fear. After everything was over, what stood out most was not remorse, but its absence. There was no widespread guilt, no collective confusion. Instead, there was a strange calm, as if the community had just completed a difficult but necessary duty. Each person returned to ordinary life with the belief that they had done the right thing. None of them saw themselves as perpetrators. This was not because they deliberately denied responsibility, but because responsibility had been distributed too evenly to grasp. Each person contributed only something small, a glance, a whisper, a timely silence, a presence in the crowd. No single action taken alone was large enough to be considered a crime. It was this fragmentation that caused responsibility to dissolve. When a decision is made by a collective, no one feels they made the decision. When an act is carried out by many, no one feels they carried it out. Responsibility is broken into pieces too small to feel heavy, and because of that, it becomes much easier to carry. The werewolf played a central role in this mechanism. It provided a single object onto which all negative emotions could be redirected: fear, anger, unease. All of it was poured into one image, When that image was removed, those emotions seemed to vanish with it. The community no longer had to face the harder question of whether they themselves had helped create it. Calling a human being a monster fundamentally changes how people experience their own actions. Killing a human requires moral justification. Eliminating a monster does not. Once this boundary is established in language and narrative, it performs the heaviest labor on behalf of conscience. It allows people to feel innocent without having to think too deeply. What is frightening is that this sense of innocence is not artificial. It is experienced sincerely. Those present believed they had done what was necessary to protect the community. They did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as ordinary people placed in a difficult situation, choosing what felt like the least harmful option available. This feeling of innocence is reinforced by the structure of the story itself. Each step in the process is presented as a reasonable response to fear. Suspicion arises from instability. Confession follows pressure. Trial occurs because an order is needed. Execution follows justice. When the entire sequence is reviewed, there is no single moment that appears as a clear act of malice, only a chain of things deemed necessary. The crowd, in this case, does not act as an entity separate from individuals. It is formed by those very individuals. But once they merge into the crowd, they lose the sense of their personal role. The crowd allows people to act without carrying the full psychological consequences of the act. It provides a form of moral anonymity. The werewolf, as the central image of the story, allows the community to complete this process fully. It is not only the threat that has been removed, it is the final explanation for everything that occurred. When the story ends there is no room left for questions of individual responsibility. Everything has been resolved. Everything has a cause, and that cause does not lie within the community itself. This creates a lasting consequence. When a community learns that it can act collectively without feeling guilt, it also learns that repeating such action is acceptable. The lesson is not taught through words, but through experience, and experience leaves a deeper mark than any warning ever could. No one in the crowd believes they will do the same thing again, but when circumstances feel similar enough, when fear grows strong enough, when the story feels familiar enough, that sense of innocence returns. It does not need to be rebuilt. It already exists within collective memory as a proven possibility. The werewolf, therefore, does more than help the community explain the past. It helps them wash their hands of it. It allows them to look back on what happened without confronting its moral complexity. When everything is placed unto a monster, people can continue to believe that at their core they are good. This is not forgiveness. It is avoidance carefully organized, and it is precisely this organization that makes it durable. When responsibility belongs to no one in particular, it cannot be pursued. When guilt is not felt, it does not need to be resolved. From this moment on, the story is no longer only about an individual or a single community. It becomes an example of how human beings can act together in ways that would otherwise be unacceptable while still believing themselves to be innocent. And it is that belief which allows the story to continue living, to continue being told, and to continue being used whenever society needs a way to confront fear without having to look directly at itself. After everything that had taken place, one detail became increasingly clear, even though no one spoke it aloud. The monster the community believed it had confronted never required the traits that would later be assigned to it. There was no moment of transformation, no fangs, no fur tearing through skin. All of those images came later. What existed from the beginning was a mechanism, not a creature. If the entire sequence of events is examined, what is frightening is not any supernatural act. It is the ordinariness of every step. Each decision appeared reasonable within its context. Each reaction could be explained by fear. No magic was needed to turn a human being into a monster. Only enough pressure to make a community believe that doing so was necessary. The wolf in this story has no fur. It leaves no tracks in the forest. It does not howl at night. It exists in broken conversations, in exchanged glances, in shared silence. It appears whenever fear is placed above doubt, whenever agreement is treated as proof. When people speak of werewolves, they often search for signs of the extraordinary. In this case, what stands out is familiarity. Everything unfolds exactly as human beings tend to respond under prolonged uncertainty. They search for causes. They tell stories to explain. They agree with one another to feel safe. No step requires people to become more cruel than usual. It only requires them to stop asking questions. Fear is the first element. It does not need to be extreme, only persistent. A formless fear is exhausting. It keeps people awake. It makes them suspicious of one another. And as exhaustion accumulates, people become willing to accept simpler explanations even when those explanations require sacrificing someone. The second element is agreement. Not an agreement declared openly, but a silent agreement. Agreement is expressed through the absence of resistance, through standing still, through allowing events to continue. When enough people behave this way, agreement becomes an atmosphere. And within that atmosphere, acting differently requires far more effort than going along. What begins to unsettle the listener is not the idea of a savage creature, but the realization that nothing in this story requires people to become anything other than themselves. There is no clear boundary where humans turn into monsters, only a chain of small, reasonable, accepted steps. When fur and fangs are stripped away, what remains is a process that has been tested and proven effective at resolving collective fear. It allows a community to identify a threat. It allows action without guilt, and it allows the belief that order has been restored. These are outcomes any society desires in moments of instability. What is most disturbing is that this process does not require evil people. It works best when carried out by people who believe they are doing the right thing. When every participant feels justified, the mechanism becomes more durable than any myth. It does not rely on superstition. It relies on human psychology. At this point, the werewolf is no longer a character in a story. It is a name for an outcome. The result of allowing fear to lead. The result of placing agreement above truth. Seen this way, the werewolf does not need to appear again to exist. It already exists in the way societies respond. The unease the listener feels does not come from what happened in the past, but from what could happen in any community. No deep forest is required, no heavy darkness. Only circumstances under enough pressure, a story familiar enough, and a group of people willing to believe they are facing something no longer human. The turn in the story does not lie in denying the myth's existence. It lies in recognizing that the myth is built from ordinary components. Once this becomes clear, the werewolf loses its mystery but becomes more frightening, because it no longer belongs to the world of legend but to the world of social behavior. The wolf does not need fur to be recognized. It is recognized in how people speak about one another when they are afraid. It appears that the moment a rumor is trusted more than a question, the moment a community chooses unity over truth, and in that moment, no one needs to change shape to become part of the story. From here, the story no longer moves along the familiar path of myth. It turns back toward the listener, not to accuse, but to introduce a quiet discomfort. If the werewolf requires no fangs or transformation, if all it needs is fear and agreement, then what truly prevents this mechanism from returning? That question does not need to be answered immediately. It only needs to be asked. And once it is asked, the werewolf without fur, without claws, without a howl, has completed its most disturbing role. It forces recognition that the monster in this story was never outside society. It was always created from within. Once the layer of myth has been stripped away, once the werewolf is seen as a mechanism rather than a creature, another question begins to surface. If everything rests on language pressure and agreement, why did it feel so real? Why did those living at the time and generations after them believe the story so deeply? The answer does not lie in a single factor. It lies in the convergence of multiple layers of experience, each persuasive in its own way. Witnesses form the first layer. In every story, witnesses provide a sense of authenticity. Someone says they saw something. Someone else says they heard something. These accounts do not need to match perfectly. In fact, small discrepancies often make them seem more credible. They create the impression this is not a scripted narrative, but fragmented experiences assembled. What matters is that witnesses do not need to see the entire event. They only need to observe a small fragment, enough to connect with the story already in circulation. A fleeting figure, an unidentified sound, an unusual movement in the forest. Once these fragments are placed within a context of fear, they immediately acquire meaning, and when they are retold, that meaning grows stronger than the original experience. The second layer consists of what are called traces. Traces do not need to be evidence in the scientific sense. They only need to resemble evidence: an indistinct footprint, a torn piece of clothing, a disturbed area of woodland. In a society ready to believe such ambiguous signs are not treated as questions, but as confirmation. Traces carry a particular power because they exist materially. They can be pointed to. They can be described. They can be remembered. When people confront something tangible, they tend to believe it is connected to a specific cause. And once that cause has been defined by the story, traces become reinforcing proof, even though the connection has never been demonstrated. The next layer is collective memory. Once a story is repeated often enough, it no longer lives only in the minds of those directly involved. It becomes part of shared memory. People who never witnessed the events remember the story as if they had experienced it themselves. Collective memory can blur the boundary between personal experience and received information. Over time, collective memory does not preserve the original ambiguity. It preserves structure. It removes uncomfortable details and emphasizes elements that fit the accepted pattern. This makes the story more coherent, easier to remember, and therefore more convincing. When many people remember a story in the same way, it creates the illusion that it must rest on something solid. Another element that makes belief durable is emotion. Fear is a powerful binding agent. Experiences tied to strong emotion tend to be remembered more deeply and for longer periods. When the werewolf story is linked to loss, unease, and danger, it is not stored as information, but as experience. And experiences are rarely questioned. This belief is further reinforced by its ability to explain too many things at once. It explains why children disappeared. Why does the forest become frightening? Why was a human being removed? When a story connects multiple questions into a single answer, it produces a sense of clarity. People are inclined to trust explanations that make the world feel orderly. Another crucial factor is repetition. Belief does not need to be correct from the beginning. It only needs to be repeated long enough. When a story is heard from many different sources, in many different contexts, it gradually loses its sense of subjectivity. It becomes self-evident. And what feels self-evident is rarely challenged. Finally, the reason the story feels real is that it exists not only in words, but in action. When a community acts on a belief, that belief is reinforced in return. Action becomes proof of the very story that led to the action. A loop is formed where belief leads to action, and action confirms belief. People believe, therefore, not because they are naive or irrational. They believe because every signal around them points to the same conclusion. Witnesses speak this way. Traces appear this way. The story is remembered this way. Actions have been carried out this way. Within such a system, doubt becomes abnormal rather than belief. Looking back, it is easy to say that it was only a myth, but for those who lived at the time, everything felt real. Not because they saw a monster, but because every surrounding element worked together to produce a coherent reality, a reality in which the werewolf existed not only in stories, but in how people understood their world. And once a belief is constructed in this way, it does not need to be true to survive. It only needs to continue being remembered, retold, and used whenever people require an explanation for a fear they are not yet ready to confront directly. As the trials gradually came to an end, As cases were no longer opened with the same pace and intensity as before, the werewolf did not disappear. It simply changed its place of residence. Instead of appearing in legal records and verdicts, it withdrew from the domain of law and entered another territory, one where it could exist longer and more safely. Culture. This transition did not happen abruptly. It unfolded slowly, almost naturally. As societies grew weary of public killing, as doubt and reflection began to surface, stories no longer ended in execution. But the need to tell stories did not vanish. The werewolf, rather than serving as a reason for action, became an object of imagination. Literature was the first space to absorb this shift. In written stories, the werewolf was no longer evidence in a case. It became a character, a figure that could be described, analyzed, and even placed within morally complex situations. Details once used to accuse were now used to create atmosphere, to build tension, to unsettle the reader, without requiring belief that such events were unfolding just beyond their door. The stage embraced the werewolf differently. On stage, the story was presented as a tragedy, an allegory, or a warning. The werewolf could be seen, but within a space implicitly acknowledged as fictional. This created a safe distance. Audiences could experience fear without needing to act. They could confront danger under the lights and leave once the curtain fell. Oral storytelling continued to play a vital role, but with a different tone. These stories no longer carried urgency. They became fireside tales, warnings for children, and entertainment for adults. With each retelling, details might change, but the core structure remained intact. The werewolf still symbolized something dangerous, but that danger no longer demanded immediate response. What matters is that from this point on, the werewolf is no longer killed in the legal sense. No trials were ending in death sentences. No public rituals meant to reassure the community. Yet the story of the werewolf continued to live, to circulate, to be reinvented. Violence withdrew from daily life and persisted in symbolic space. This shift did not weaken the story. On the contrary, it made the werewolf more durable. Detached from immediate consequence, the story could be told more freely, more creatively. It could be reshaped to fit new fears, new contexts. The werewolf became a flexible template, capable of adapting across eras. In the process, memory of the original cases slowly faded. Legal details and specific names fell away. What remained were images, sensations, fear rendered abstract. This allowed society to retain the story without confronting its historical responsibility. The werewolf became part of cultural inheritance, no longer a direct moral question. Notably, once the werewolf entered culture, it began to carry multiple meanings. It could represent instinct, loss of control, the darker parts of human nature. These meanings did not contradict the story's origins, but they made it easier to accept. Rather than justifying violence, the werewolf became a tool for reflection. Yet the absence of killing does not make the story harmless. The structures that produced the werewolf in the past remained intact, merely covered by a cultural layer. The story continued to teach people how to distinguish between the normal and abnormal, safe and dangerous. It did so more subtly, but no less effectively. When law retreated, culture took over, and culture holds a distinct advantage. It does not need to prove anything. It does not need to be correct. It only needs to resonate. In its new role, the werewolf does not need to exist in reality to influence how people think. It only needs to be told. This transition marked a new phase in the life of the story. The werewolf is no longer a justification for collective action, but a mirror for society to look into. Yet, this mirror was never entirely clear. It was distorted, symbolic, sometimes softening the sharp edges of history. With the trials over, society could believe it had progressed, and in some ways, that belief was justified. Public violence diminished. Ritualized killing was no longer seen as a solution, but the story remained, carrying with it the entire structure of thought that once allowed such acts to occur. It merely changed form to persist, and because the werewolf continued to be told, even without killing, the story never truly closed. It simply lay dormant within literature, theater, and oral tradition, waiting for the moment when society once again needed a familiar image to name its own fear. Once the story had traveled far enough, once the werewolf had left the domain of law and taken refuge in culture, once public violence had been replaced by metaphor and symbol, one conclusion became difficult to avoid. When the entire sequence is traced back from the earliest cases to the stories retold centuries later, what emerges is not the image of a creature. What emerges is human beings. The cases were never truly about wolves. There is no evidence that another species lurked in the forest attacking communities in the manner described. What existed were people living under pressure, facing prolonged uncertainty, and searching for a way to make the world feel understandable again. The werewolf was not the cause. It was the result. Seen this way, many details begin to realign. Confessions no longer appear as strange tales, but as products of a system of questioning that had already shaped its answers. Trials no longer resemble searches for justice, but rituals confirming belief. Executions no longer appear as responses to danger, but as actions permitted by a collective agreement. This did not require people to become more cruel than their nature. On the contrary, it required them to believe they were doing what was right. Violence in this context did not appear as deviant behavior. It appeared as a solution. When violence is placed within an appropriate moral frame, it no longer needs to be hidden. It is carried out openly with community participation and with the feeling that it is necessary. Fear occupied the central position in this process, not fear of a specific creature, but a diffuse fear of losing control. When children disappeared, when harvests failed, when social order weakened, people needed to believe there was a concrete cause. That belief provided a sense of control, even if it was illusory. The werewolf, in this role, became the perfect answer to a question society was not prepared to face directly. Permitted violence did not emerge from nowhere. It was built step by step through language, story, and ritual. Each step made the next easier to accept. Suspicion led to isolation. Isolation led to accusation. The accusation led to legal confirmation, and legal confirmation led to action. In retrospect, there is no single moment that looks like a dramatic moral leap, only a gradual slope where each step seemed reasonable at the time. What is most disturbing is not that people did this in the past. It is that they did it without believing themselves to be evil. They did not see themselves as perpetrators. They saw themselves as protectors. And when a community believes it is protecting itself, the usual boundaries of morality begin to shift. Viewing the werewolf as a creature allows distance. It makes violence appear as a response to an external threat. But when that layer is removed, what remains is a familiar mechanism, one that allows society to determine who belongs and who does not, who deserves protection and who may be removed. This is not a story about a superstitious age. It is a story about how human beings organize fear. There is no need to state this explicitly for the listener to understand. When the pieces are placed side by side, recognition occurs on its own. The cases no longer look like strange historical anomalies. They resemble extreme instances of a logic that once operated and under certain conditions could operate again. That logic does not require wolves. It requires only a story strong enough to legitimize action. When the listener realizes that the werewolf is not the central figure, but merely a narrative device, unease begins to set in. Not fear of the past, but fear of repetition. If these cases speak about human beings, about fear, and about sanctioned violence, then they are not bound by time or place. They belong to any society capable of falling under similar pressure. The climax of the story does not arrive through a shocking revelation. It arrives in the silence after the details have been laid out. No conclusion is spoken aloud. No lesson is written. There is only a space in which the listener connects what has been seen, and in that space the werewolf loses its familiar shape, revealing what was always present behind it. What was created was not a myth of a half-human, half-beast creature, What was created was a way of thinking that allows society to believe that violence, under certain conditions, is reasonable, that removing a human being can be a solution. That fear can be managed by identifying someone to blame. When the listener reaches this realization on their own, the story completes its task. It does not need to declare what is right or wrong. It only needs to show how it once happened. And once seen, it cannot be easily unseen. At that point, the werewolf is no longer a creature in the forest. It becomes an unresolved question about how human beings respond when they believe their fear must be addressed at any cost. After every detail has been laid out, after the story has completed its journey from a specific individual to a social mechanism, what remains is not a clear conclusion. It is a pause in which the story no longer guides but leaves the listener alone with what has just been recognized. This story happened, not in myth, but in human life. It occurred when a community was frightened enough to search for a cause, when it was exhausted enough to accept a simple explanation, when it was united enough to believe its actions were necessary. None of these elements was extraordinary, and it is precisely that ordinariness that makes the story unsettling. There was no single moment in the entire sequence that looked like a point of no return. No one stood up and declared that from here on, something unacceptable would be done. Everything unfolded step by step. Each step could be justified. Each decision had its reasons. And looking back, it becomes clear that no real monster was required to produce the outcome. The story ends, but it does not close, because it was never built to end. It was built to exist as a possibility that has already been realized. And possibilities like this do not disappear simply because time passes. They only require familiar conditions to emerge again. No deep forest is needed, no heavy darkness, no creatures half human and half beast, only a fear without shape, only a community seeking order, only a story convincing enough to bind fragments of unease together. When those elements converge, the story can begin again, even under a different name. What is most haunting is not that people once did this. It is that they did it while believing they were protecting what was right. When a community believes its actions are necessary to preserve order, it rarely sees itself as part of the problem. It sees a threat to be managed and it acts. At that moment, the question is no longer who is right or wrong. The question is what allows this process to unfold without being stopped. What makes doubt appear dangerous? What agrees look like evidence? What makes violence seem reasonable when framed within a suitable story? This story does not demand that the listener reach a conclusion. It offers no explicit warning. It presents only an awareness. What happened did not require particularly evil people. It required ordinary people facing ordinary pressures to make choices that appeared reasonable at the time. When people think of werewolves, they imagine a moment of transformation, a second when a human ceases to be human. This story shows that no such moment exists. There is no clear boundary, only a chain of small things, connected one after another, leading to an outcome no one realizes they helped create. And because there is no clear boundary, no marked point, the final question cannot be when this happened. The question must be what prevents it from happening. What causes a community to stop midway? What makes a story unacceptable, even when it is convenient? What allows someone to stand outside agreement without being seen as a threat? The story does not answer these questions. It only shows that there was a time when they were not asked. And the consequences of that silence still echo, not in the form of a creature, but in how people tell stories about themselves, about their fear, and about what they believe is necessary to survive. As the story closes, the image of the werewolf no longer stands at the center. What remains is a space where the listener is forced to fill it with their own reflection. No conclusion is spoken aloud. No lesson is written down. Only a quiet recognition that this story once happened, and because it once happened, the possibility of repetition cannot be dismissed by denial alone. If this has happened before, not in legend, but in human life, then what truly prevents it from happening again? Not in some distant place, but anywhere. People face fear and search for a story strong enough to convince them that everything will be fine if someone is removed. That question does not need an immediate answer. It only needs to be held, because holding the question, rather than rushing toward a convenient explanation, may be the only thing that keeps this story from beginning again.